I stood there, on the rotting wooden steps of the house that had once been my home, the shotgun cold in my hand, my breath misting the Wyoming morning air. The sun had just risen, casting a faint light through the towering pines, but the light could do nothing to dispel the chill that seeped into my bones. It had been 3 years since Clara had left, and each day felt like a knife to the heart. And the farm, once filled with her laughter, was now a lonely ghost. But this morning, something felt different. A strange feeling, as if the world were whispering a secret I wasn't ready to hear. I found the first blood trail right by the well, where I stopped every morning to wash my face and remind myself that I was still alive. The drops were a deep red, glistening in the sunlight, not like the blood of a wounded deer or bear. No, they were too even, too deliberate, as if something had deliberately left a mark. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange sense that what awaited me was not of the world I knew. I gripped my gun, my finger hovering over the trigger, and began to follow the trail, stepping cautiously across the leaf-covered ground. Every drop of blood told a story. I could feel the pain in it, the desperation, the fierce will to survive. I had lived long enough in this land to read the tracks of nature. Wounded deer staggered, spilling blood. Bears left large, clumsy trails. But this thing moved like a ghost, knowing exactly where it needed to go. I could smell the scent in the air, turpentine, damp earth, and something else, wild and primal, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't fear, but a warning from deep within, as if my ancestors were whispering, "Be careful, Thaddeus. There's something here that doesn't belong." The trail of blood led me past the old barn, where the last of the cows had been sold after Clara's death. I couldn't bear to care for them when my heart was broken. The chicken coop, now a pile of rotting wood, stood silently nearby, a reminder of the days when Clara and I had dreamed of a simpler life. The trail of blood grew thicker, larger, as if the bleeding were weakening, slowing. I tightened my grip on the gun, my finger on the trigger, but my heart was pounding, not just from danger, but from a strange sense that I was about to face something that would change me forever. Then I saw her. She was huddled behind the old barn where I'd smoked meat during the long winters. A young girl, but unlike anyone I'd ever seen. Her long black hair was tangled, matted with leaves and mud, as if she'd been rolling around in the woods for weeks. Her clothes, if you could call them clothes, were tattered animal skins, clinging to her thin frame. A deep gash on her left arm still seeped blood, staining her pale skin. But it wasn't the wound that stopped me, not her hair or her trembling hands. It was the way she sat, not sitting, but crouching, like a wolf ready to spring. Her hands were planted on the ground, her fingers curled like claws, and her eyes, God, those eyes. Those eyes weren't human. They were the eyes of a creature that had forgotten how to be human, that knew only how to survive, only how to fight. When she looked at me, I felt like prey being examined by a predator. There was no fear in her gaze, only cold calculation, as if she were weighing whether I was a threat or an opportunity. Then she tilted her head at an odd, unnatural angle, and I heard a sound, a low growl deep in her throat, like a cornered wolf. The growl made my blood run cold. I had faced bears before, shot down hungry wolves, but I had never felt so small. I stood there, gun in hand, but I couldn't pull the trigger. There was something in her eyes, a flash of wildness, a crack in the animalistic shell. Pain. Not physical pain, though blood still flowed from her arm, but a deeper pain, the pain of a soul abandoned, forgotten. I saw myself in those eyes, the man who had lost the light of his life when Clara left, who had lived like a shadow, no longer knowing what he lived for. "Who are you?" I whispered, knowing she wouldn't answer. My voice was broken, not with fear, but with a strange sense that I was standing before a wonder, a mystery I didn't deserve to witness. She didn't answer, just growled again, her lips pulling back to reveal sharp, bloody teeth. But she didn't attack. She just looked, as if studying me, smelling me, assessing me. I realized that if I made the wrong move, if I showed any sign of threat, she would disappear into the woods like the wind, or worse, she would lunge at me with all the force of a wounded animal. I lowered my gun, slowly, carefully, the way I had tamed wild horses before Clara died. I knew the language of fear, of survival. But this girl was no horse. She was something more, a spirit caught between man and beast, between light and dark. I felt my heart pounding, not from danger, but from a sense of aliveness I had long forgotten. 3 years of solitude had turned me into a ghost, but now, standing before this girl, I felt the blood rushing through my veins, as if I were being pulled back into life. "You're hurt," I said, my voice soft, as if to a child. "I can help." But she didn't understand or didn't want to. She tilted her head again, her eyes narrowing, and I could see the struggle inside her, the instinct to flee versus the hunger and pain. Blood was still dripping from her arm, droplets falling to the ground, mixing with the dirt. I wanted to move forward, to bandage the wound, but I knew that any sudden movement would shatter the fragile moment. I rummaged in my coat pocket and found a piece of beef jerky that I always carried with me when I worked in the fields. The smell of the meat made the girl stop. Her nose twitched, and her growling stopped. Her eyes locked on my hand, but not with the hunger of a hungry animal. Rather, with curiosity, as if she didn't understand why I was offering something without asking for anything in return. I tossed the meat to the ground a few feet away from her, then stepped back to make her feel safe. She didn't rush forward. She looked at me, her eyes sharp as knives, searching for deception, for danger. I stood still, letting her see that I was not the enemy. Finally, she moved, on all fours, quick as a panther. She grabbed the meat and backed into the corner of the shed, tearing at it with her teeth. I watched her eat, and my heart ached. The scars that crisscrossed her arms and legs told the story of a life I could not have imagined. A life without home, without love, only pure survival. But beneath the dirt and blood, I saw a strange beauty, not the gentle beauty of Clara, but the beauty of a storm, of an unquenchable forest fire. When she finished eating, she looked at me, not with gratitude, but with pragmatic appraisal. I was food. I was something new, something foreign, and she hadn't decided whether I was trustworthy. I wanted to say something, to ask how long she'd been out there, how she'd survived, but I knew she wouldn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, but because she'd forgotten how to speak, how to trust. Then a sound came, a distant bird call, or the creak of a barn in the wind, and the girl sprang to her feet, her body taut as a bowstring, ready to flee. I felt a strange fear, not of her, but of losing her. Afraid that she would disappear into the woods, and I would never know whether this moment was real or just another dream, born of long, lonely nights. I took a step forward, and her growl rang out, sharp as a knife, promising violence, but I did not retreat. For the first time in 3 years, I felt truly alive, and I would not let this moment pass. I stood there, a few feet from the girl, my heart pounding as if it would burst from my chest. She, who I later learned was Wren, was still crouched behind the barn, her eyes piercing me. Blood was still seeping from the wound on her arm, but she showed no pain, no whimpers, no pleas, just the cold silence of a creature that had learned to survive at any cost. I had never seen anyone like her, not human, not quite animal, but something in between, a soul caught in the chasm between two worlds. And I, a widowed farmer who had long since given up hope, felt a strange light flickering inside me, as if she were the answer to a question I had stopped asking since Clara died. I still held the shotgun, but my finger was off the trigger. It would have been easier to pull the trigger, a shot, and I could go back to my solitary life without having to face something that made me feel both scared and curious. But there was something in her eyes, wild as they were, that made me flinch. A deep ache, not from the wound on my arm, but from somewhere deeper, where I had lost my way too. 3 years ago, as Clara lay in bed, her breathing faint from the fever, she had held my hand and whispered, "Find a reason to live, Thaddeus." I hadn't, until today. "You need help," I said, my voice hoarse, as if I were the one asking. She didn't answer, just tilted her head, a strange, inhuman gesture. The growl in her throat stopped, but her eyes remained fixed on me, as if I were a puzzle she hadn't solved. I realized that if I wanted her to believe me, I had to do more than stand there and talk. I had to show her that I wasn't a threat. I rummaged in my pocket and found a piece of beef jerky, something I always carried with me when I worked in the fields. The smell made her nose twitch, and I saw a glint in her eyes, not hunger, but curiosity. I dropped the meat on the ground halfway between us and took a few steps back to make her feel safe. She didn't rush forward as I expected a hungry animal to do. Instead, she looked at me, her eyes sharp as knives, searching for any sign of deception. I stood still, not daring to breathe, afraid that a false move would shatter this fragile moment. Finally, she moved, crawling on all fours, as nimble as a panther. She grabbed the meat and backed into the corner of the shed, tearing it apart with her teeth. I watched her eat, and my heart sank. The scars that crisscrossed her arms and legs told a story I dared not imagine. Years of living in the woods, facing death every day, no one to protect her, no one to care. But beneath the dirt and blood, I saw a strange beauty, not the gentle beauty of Clara, but the beauty of a storm, of an unquenchable forest fire. When she finished eating, she looked at me, not with gratitude but with pragmatic appraisal. I was a source of food, something new, something foreign, and she hadn't decided whether I was trustworthy. I wanted to say something, to ask how long she'd been out there, how she'd survived, but I knew she wouldn't answer, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd forgotten how to speak, how to trust. I took another piece of jerky from my pocket, but this time I didn't throw it on the ground. I held it in my hand, holding it out to her, slowly, the way I had done with the wild horses before Clara died. "Come here," I said, my voice soft like a child's. "I won't hurt you." She looked at my hand, then at my eyes, and I saw the struggle in them. She wanted the meat, but she feared the price. For her, everything had a price, a harsh lesson the jungle had taught her. She approached, each step cautious, her body taut as a bowstring. I could smell her scent, pine, forest, and something wild that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When she was so close that I could see the gold in her brown eyes, I felt my heart pounding harder than ever. Not from fear, but from a strange sense that I was standing in the presence of something magical, a mystery that I did not deserve to witness. Then a sound came, a distant bird call, or the creak of a barn in the wind, and the girl sprang to her feet, her body taut as a bowstring, ready to run. I felt a strange fear, not of her, but of losing her, afraid that she would disappear into the woods, and I would never know whether this moment was real or just another dream, born of long, lonely nights. "Don't go," I said, my voice hoarse, almost pleading. "Stay." She looked at me, and for a moment I saw a light in her eyes, not trust, but curiosity. She tilted her head as if trying to understand me, as if I were a strange creature to her, as she was to me. I stood still, letting her see that I was not an enemy. Then, slowly, she sat back down, still keeping her distance, but no longer growling. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, as if I had overcome a challenge I did not know I was facing. I wanted to heal her wounds, to show her that not all humans bring pain, but I knew it would take time. She was not a wild horse, not an animal. She was a broken soul, abandoned by the world, and I, a man who had given up on myself, felt a strong desire to help her find her true self again. Clara once said that love was finding light in another person's darkness. Perhaps in this girl's wild eyes, I had found my own light. The distant sound of hooves echoed through the valley like thunder, pulling me out of my fragile moment with Wren. My heart pounded, not because of the wild girl sitting before me, but because of the sense of approaching danger. I had lived long enough in Wyoming to recognize the sounds of bounty hunters. Men who came not to talk, but to take what they wanted, in blood if necessary. I stood, gripping my shotgun, and looked toward the horizon, where 3 figures on horseback appeared, kicking up dust beneath their hooves. Wren sensed the threat before I spoke. She sprang to her feet, her body taut as a bowstring, her eyes flashing the light of a cornered animal. A low growl escaped her throat, and I saw her back away, ready to disappear into the woods. "Don't," I said, my voice hoarse, almost pleading. "Stay with me." But her eyes were no longer on me. They were locked on the approaching figures, and I knew she had faced people like this before, people who hunted her, not for who she was, but for what she was. The 3 men stopped about 20 yards away, their horses breathing heavily, steam rising in the cold air. Amos Holt, the leader, sat bolt upright in his saddle, his smile as sharp as a knife. Beside him were his cousins, Jonah and Eli, men I knew well from Pine Hollow. They weren't the type to come for a chat. Amos spat on the ground, his eyes sweeping over my farm, then settling on Wren. "Good morning, Cain," he said, his voice smooth but menacing. "I hear you're hiding something that doesn't belong to you." I tightened my grip on the gun, my finger hovering over the trigger. "I'm not hiding anything, Amos," I said, my voice calm, but my heart was pounding like it was going to burst out of my chest. "You're on my land, and I didn't invite you in." Jonah, the big guy with the rope wrapped around his saddle, sneered. "Your land, but that monster isn't. The people of Pine Hollow are in a panic over lost chickens and sheep. The trail leads right here." I glanced at Wren, and my heart sank. She stood there, her body tense, her eyes flashing with the same wildness I'd seen when I'd first met her. But I saw something else too, a flash of fear, not of death, but of being captured, of having her freedom taken away. I knew that if I let these men get close, they wouldn't hesitate to kill her, or worse, drag her back to town like an animal for show. "She's not a monster," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "She's human, and you're not touching her." Amos laughed, but his eyes were cold. "A man? Look at him, Cain. He moves like a wolf, growls like a beast. $50 for his head, and we intend to take it." He dismounted, his hand sliding over the pistols at his belt. Jonah and Eli dismounted, forming a circle around me, blocking my retreat to the warehouse. I raised my gun, aimed it at Amos's chest. "Get back on your horse and get out of here," I said, my voice hard as steel, "or there will be blood." But before Amos could reply, a sound rang out from the barn. A sharp, inhuman growl. Wren shot out, not from the door, but from the attic window, like a falling star. She landed in a perfect leap, her body absorbing the impact as if she were made for it. Jonah spun, his gun aimed at her, but she was faster, stronger, a storm unleashed. She lunged at Jonah, a scream ripping from her throat, like the howl of a cornered panther. They fell to the ground, and I saw blood spurt as she bit Jonah's arm, his gun flying away. Eli screamed, panicked, drawing his gun but not daring to fire for fear of hitting Jonah. Amos drew his pistol, but I was faster. A shot from my shotgun rang out, the bullet hitting Amos in the shoulder, sending him falling, blood staining his shirt. "Run!" Eli shouted, backing up to his horse. He leaped into the saddle and spurred his horse into a gallop toward the hill. Jonah, ashen-faced and clutching his bleeding arm, staggered to his feet and followed. Amos, wounded as he was, screamed, "That monster! I'll be back, Cain!" But when Wren stood, blood on her lips, her eyes a warning that anyone who came back would pay a higher price. I stood there, gun still in hand, breathing heavily. Wren looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a different light in her eyes, not trust, but recognition. She knew I had stood between her and death, and I knew that, whatever she was, I would not let anyone hurt her. Not today, not ever. The hoofbeats came again, heavier this time, more numerous. I stood in front of the barn, Wren behind me, her body tense, ready to fight or flee. I felt my blood run cold as I saw the men from Pine Hollow coming up the hill, 6 at least, led by Sheriff Ellis, his badge gleaming in the sunlight. Beside him stood Mayor Grayson, a portly man who had never faced real danger, and 4 other men I recognized from my church days. They had not come to talk. They had come to end a threat they did not understand. I tightened my grip on my gun, but I knew that shooting at these men would not solve anything. These were not the Holt brothers, bounty hunters who cared only for money. These were good men, fathers, husbands, driven by fear and rumor. I looked at Wren and my heart sank. She stood there, her eyes wild, but there was also fear. Not fear of death, but fear of being stripped of her freedom, caged like an animal. "Cain," Sheriff Ellis called, his voice ringing with regret. "We heard from the Holt brothers. They said you were hiding something dangerous. A monster attacked Jonah." He dismounted, his hand on the hilt of his gun but not yet drawn. I stepped forward, between Wren and the group. "There are no monsters here," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Just a wounded girl hunted by men who want the reward." Mayor Grayson, still mounted, cleared his throat. "They say she's a beast, Cain, tore into Jonah like a wolf. The people of Pine Hollow are terrified. We can't have something like that living near town." I felt the blood rush to my head. "A thing?" She's human, Grayson. She survived conditions none of you could endure for a week. Wren stepped out from behind me, and I heard a gasp from the crowd. She stood up straight, no longer hunched over, but her eyes were still sharp, scanning each person as if calculating an escape route. She was beautiful, in a way none of them could understand. A wild, untamable beauty. "Show us her, Kane," Ellis said, his voice softer but still firm. "If she's not dangerous, we need to know." I looked at Wren, and for a moment I saw the struggle in her eyes. She understood that this was a decisive moment, that she could run, but the price would be being hunted forever. I put my hand on her shoulder gently and said, "Let them see who you are." She looked at me, and I saw a small glimmer of trust for the first time since we met. She came up, stood beside me, and said, her voice hoarse, unfamiliar with words, "No people, just forest, just life." The words were like a stone thrown into a still lake, silencing the crowd. They looked at her, not as an animal, but as someone the world had abandoned. But Grayson was not so easily convinced. "She attacked people, Kane. She can't be here." I felt anger flare up like wildfire. "They hunted her like an animal, cornered her. What would you do if you were threatened like that?" I looked Ellis in the eyes, the only one in the crowd I thought would understand. "She didn't choose to live like this, but I choose to stand by her." Then a crazy thought flashed through my mind. I don't know where it came from, but it was so strong I couldn't stop it. "She is my wife," I said, my voice clear and resonant. "We were married this morning by the laws of the land, with Ellis as witness." The crowd froze. Ellis looked at me, his eyes wide, but he didn't argue. I saw a glint in his eye, sympathy, or just surprise, I wasn't sure. Grayson started to protest, but Ellis raised a hand. "If Kane says they're married, I'll be a witness," he said, his voice slow. Wren looked at me, her eyes filled with confusion, but also with a new light, as if she understood that I was putting my life on the line to protect her. And in that moment, I knew that I would never regret this decision, no matter where it took me. 6 months passed, and my farm was no longer the lonely place I had known. Wren was still there, and every day I watched her change, like a flower blooming from the dry soil. She learned to speak, word by word, her voice hoarse but growing clearer. She learned to use a spoon, to laugh, to look into my eyes without looking for deception. But most of all, she taught me how to live again, how to find light in the darkness I had been in since Clara died. In the early days, she was still wild, still tilting her head like an animal, still growling when strangers approached. But I was patient, the way I had been patient with wild horses. I taught her how to fold clothes, how to boil water, how to plant potatoes in the backyard. Each small step was a victory, not only for her, but for me. I saw myself in her, someone who had forgotten how to live, how to believe, how to hope. The people of Pine Hollow, initially fearful of her, gradually changed. They began calling her Mrs. Kane, even though Wren and I had never been formally married. My lie that day had become the truth in their eyes and perhaps in ours. They told new stories about her, not the wolf girl, but a girl lost in the woods, rescued by a widower. I didn't correct them. The truth wasn't as important as how they saw her now, but it wasn't always easy. There were nights when Wren would wake up screaming inhumanly as if the woods were calling her home. There were times when she would stand by the window looking out at the distant mountains, and I feared that one day she would run away, back to where she belonged. But then she would turn, look at me, and say, "Stay, study." And each time, my heart would burst with a feeling I never thought I would feel again. Love. I taught her to read slowly. I read to her stories from the book Clara had loved, and sometimes I saw her smile, a small smile, but enough to light up the room. She taught me how to listen to the wind, how to smell the rain before it came, how to live without fear. We became two pieces, imperfect, but fitting together, as if we were destined to meet. Sometimes on nights when the wind howled through the Wyoming mountains, I heard her call. Not in words, but in long, wild howls that echoed across the valley. The people of Pine Hollow pulled their blankets tighter, not out of fear, but out of a secret envy. They heard freedom in that howl, a freedom they had never known. And I, lying beside Wren, knew that I had found what Clara wanted me to find, a reason to live, someone to run with, no matter where the road led.